Good day, dear listeners and viewers. I salute you all. My name is Nathan from Fenlina Management Consultants, the main sponsors of this program known as Entrepreneurship and Sustainable Development. It gives me great pleasure when I get the opportunity of exchanging my views regarding entrepreneurship and sustainable development. The lecture for today is This is one of the series of free lectures with the aim of creating and promoting an unprecedented entrepreneurship culture in our communities in Africa. This program is ongoing and needs support of all forms in order to ignite and maintain the entrepreneurship banner in the whole African continent. Your participation is highly welcome. It could be through lectures, plays, comedies, presentations, financial assistance, and so on. The objective of this particular presentation is to unpack the concept of entrepreneurship and sustainable development in our communities with the aim of addressing risk. To understand the risks bedeviling Africa in the implementation of the SDG as a continent, as individual states, and as individuals. There are already participants determined to face and mitigate the risks so that the SDGs become a reality. We see evidence of the work they do and the work they have done in addressing risks relating to poverty, hunger, social injustice, and managing the ecosystems. We can use the Sustainable Development Indicators to analyze progress. For instance, how the situation was at the beginning of 2016 and how it was by the end of 2022 for the individual countries. Or how the situation was at the beginning of 2016 when the SDG Agenda started and how it was by the end of 2022 for the entire continent. There are also external powers and influences which are determined to make sure that the SDG Agenda fails in Africa. We should take cognizance of the fact that neocolonialism is still alive in some parts of our beloved continent. The Sustainable Development Goals agenda consists of three main pillars: alleviating poverty and hunger, establishing and maintaining peace and justice, plus effective stewardship of nature. From these three pillars, we have 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which have measurable indicators that are SMART: specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. Each country should set its own targets for each of the Sustainable Development Goals. These goals are there, they are being set, but we don't know as common people, and we need to get that information so that we can be following and monitoring our progress. If all these targets are consolidated into one target for the continent for each SDG, we are then going to be able to monitor performance of each country and the progress of the continent as a whole. All the countries will be pursuing the SDGs in one clear direction, and failure of one country should be regarded as failure of the whole continent. Then we shall be looking for solutions together to address the challenges. My suggestion here is that experts should communicate these indicators at all levels in our communities. If we do not do so, this definitely takes them out of the engagement. It is not easy to co-own a target that is not understandable. It's not understandable. It is not being communicated. We must not leave the understanding of the SDGs to the experts if we want to run the race together, and if we want to see real sustainable development with no one being left behind. A number of countries have gone significant strides in addressing the issue of sustainable development, each in their own way. But the following questions have always remained. Is this issue of sustainable development known to the common man? Is the layman even able to proudly comment about his contribution in this regard? At local level or even provincial level, are the leaders able to inform their followers about their individual contribution to sustainable development in terms of figures? These are the questions that need precise answers. There are different views about risk and investment in Africa. In the summit which was held in Ghana in early 2023, it was Africa Investment Forum, and the countries which were involved were Ghana, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, and others. They were asked to give account of the progress in their respective countries about risk and investing in Africa. To the listener like me, it was good to hear about the progress, but the reports were not followed by measurable evidence in line with the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. In other words, it was not easy to know whether there is progress or not based on the targets, because there must be a target. Tough questions were raised about Africa's seriousness in strengthening investment amidst the risks. In his response, Mr. Emerson Mnangagwa, President of Zimbabwe, was very articulate about the following facts relating to Zimbabwe and Africa at large. He emphasized that we must carry out a SWOT analysis. By SWOT, we mean strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We must carry out a SWOT analysis. We shall then be able to prioritize based on what we want and take advantage of the opportunities available to the continent. We must avoid the mistakes of other developed economies. We must develop our own pathways to avoid being divided. We must cherish collaboration. It is not necessary to reinvent the wheel. We must cherish connectivity with each other in terms of infrastructure. We must take advantage of beneficiation of our resources.
My view is that first and foremost, each African country, or Africa as a continent, should prioritize what we want and invite investment in the areas we ourselves want. The development of a country should not be determined from outside. It should be an internal priority in terms of the order of development. Is it agriculture? Is it mining? Is it tourism? Infrastructure development? We have to make those choices ourselves. Secondly, before we spend time addressing the perception of the outside world, I think it is necessary for us as Africa to integrate ourselves, understand ourselves as a continent, share what we have in terms of resources. Africa has abundant resources. It has youthful population. It has now the knowledge that the developed world have traveled a journey of developing their countries. And we are in that advantage that as we wish to leapfrog and develop our respective countries, we should not fall into the similar mistakes which the other countries, the developed countries went through. If we fail to recognize that we need to chart our own development pathway, then we will find that we will be divided. We will look outside Africa when we could have answers within Africa. So it is my view that, in particular for Zimbabwe, we cherish collaboration. We cherish to share our challenges with our brothers and sisters on the continent before we look out. So I don't think that the outside the world would love to see Africa develop to an extent that we are competitive with them. They would want to see Africa as a source of their raw materials to develop their own economies. Well, hence, I appeal to our brothers and sisters in Africa that God gave us this continent and we must develop it. Yes, we are not going to invent the wheel, but we must make choices which fit our level of development by collaboration. It is necessary that as we develop, as my brother said, connectivity, we need to have roads, infrastructure which talk to each other with neighbors and with regions. We need to have railway systems which are able to talk to each other in terms of our neighbors as well as with the region in Africa, as well as the air linkages between us and the rest of Africa. At the time of our independence, for instance, because we're a British colony, if we wanted to come to Ghana, which is a former British colony also, we first have to go to London and then come back to Africa to Accra. And when we go back to London to report and then go back to Harare. That was stupid. So we need to have internal connectivity as Africa. We have decided that most importantly, food security is primary. And we focused and developed mitigation against climate change in our country. For instance, now for the rest of the history of our country, we're importing wheat from Ukraine or Russia. But because we felt that it is necessary under the circumstances that we should build dams, develop irrigation in our country, we now have adequate wheat for ourselves and surplus. And the same with regard to grain. As a result of developing our own and having internal focusing on the abundant arable land which we have, we are secured, we are now a food security country. And that's what we should do. We have minerals. In the past, all our minerals go out, but we have now focused on the issue of beneficiation of our minerals. Also, even in the agricultural sector, processing, we are developing that. Just as an example, when the pandemic, this pandemic, COVID-19 attacked us, because we are a country under sanctions, we did not receive anything from the global West to support us on mitigating the impact of COVID-19. We looked inwards and diverted some resources from other infrastructure development to develop our own resilience and acquire vaccines. For instance, the issue of medical oxygen. We could not access medical oxygen, so we assembled some of our young scientists, young girls and young boys, and within 9 to 12 months, we were able to produce our own medical oxygen. And now Zimbabwe uses about 150 tons of medical oxygen a month, but we are now producing that amount in a week. So you can see that if we look at the potential of our own young people, we can do a lot to have our countries solid in terms of being self-dependent and benefiting from the Africa continental trade area.
Zimbabwe is determined to pursue all sustainable development strategies in their country and Africa at large. My concerns, though, are: does Zimbabwe's Sustainable Development Plan align with the SDGs of Africa as a continent? Is risk mitigation an integral part of their Sustainable Development Goals agenda? If so, do all the people on the ground have full knowledge and what role they need to play both now and in the future? The answers lie with the majority of the Zimbabwean people themselves. Let's talk about risk perception and mitigation. Investors have perception of Africa being a risky continent. What are your views, and how can the risks be reduced for Africa in general and your countries? This was the second question asked in the same summit. In her answer, the president of Ethiopia said that there is no investment that is risk-free. There are always opportunities amidst challenges. There will never be a perfect environment for investment. The higher the risk, the higher the return. Based on her responses, it is very clear that for the entrepreneurship to thrive in Africa, the issue of risk is a major concern and needs to be taken seriously if Africa is to benefit. The higher the risk, the higher the returns, but to the investor. It means, therefore, where there are risks, there are more fortunes for the investor.
So you talked about risks, and I understand that when we are gathered here with investors and us representing our respective governments, this issue would be raised. But I'm asking the question if there is anything which is risk-free in whatever we do. I think it's important to have that in mind, and that there is also opportunities in the midst of challenges, as it has been said earlier, and I think I'm well placed to say it, coming from Ethiopia. It's important that we understand clearly the nexus that exists now between peace, security, and development. I don't think there is any situation where everything will be perfect for investors to come. And so this has been said time and again in many gatherings, but I think it has to sink in more so that we really understand that there is the linkage between the two. There is no perfect situation, to my view. And the other point I would like to raise is that there is always returns with investment. Investment is a risk, in fact. Risk is linked to returns. And returns are not immediate, they are long-term. So this has also to be taken into account when we talk about risks. This is what I would like to say. Thank you.
A risky investment creates a climate that scares investors and increases the cost of doing business. Minimizing risk should be taken seriously as part of the SDGs. President Akufo-Addo of Ghana emphasized some of what was mentioned in the Somali president's speech. He also added that Africa needs to have shared growth, shared development, shared prosperity.
The center of everything that is happening in our continent. There's something which is called the African premium risk, which is become a big obstacle for people wanting to put their money in our continent. Because behind it is the concept that somehow investing in Africa is a riskier undertaking than investing elsewhere in the world. And that is what has propelled a great deal of the difficulties that the continent is going through now. The global economic environment is difficult. All of us are aware of that. We're also aware, unfortunately, that it has provided an opportunity for a lot of capital to flow out of Africa back to the developed world, especially with the Federal Reserve's board policy on the dollar, which is leading to a great deal of difficulties for many of the currencies in our part of the world. But at the heart of it is this perception that investing in our continent is a risk. And yet, the continent has an excellent record as far as default on loans are concerned. It has an excellent record in terms of return on investments. Dr. Adesina indicated that in his very enlightening speech. The areas of concern to the world, the resources are in Africa, whether we're talking about regenerative agriculture that is going to help us deal with climate change. Our continent provides the biggest opportunity for it. We have the world's largest set of arable land, and we go about it properly. The decarbonization of the world, which is now one of the major issues confronting our generation, will be better addressed through the African continent than anywhere else in the world. So we have all of these matters which bring together, provide a very different image of what investing in our part of the world represents than the standard one which has led to the creation of the African premium risk. And my appeal to the investor community that is seen here is, yes, there are problems, there are difficulties, there are major challenges, but long beyond the challenges of what the future holds. You're dealing in a continent which in less than 25 years' time is going to account for 1 in every 4 people on the universe. That's a huge demographic dividend that needs to be taken advantage of. 75% of the population that I'm referring to are going to be people under the age of 35. So you've got dynamism, you have opportunity, you have longevity in investments, which is guaranteed by this population. I think that if you put all of these things together, and of course, the very, very significant efforts being made by African governments to create a proper regulatory, legal and regulatory environment to incentivize investment as well as protect investments on the continent. We have a mix that potentially could be very dynamic for people who are prepared to take the risk. There are $3-4 trillion of investable capital in the private sector floating in the world. Even a percentage of that, 1, 2, or 3% of that, coming onto the African would be transformative for the African economy. And we will then be creating a different paradigm, a paradigm which has to do with people growing prosperous together, rather than the paradigm that the world has accepted in the last, for as long as we can remember, where parts of the world are wealthy and other parts have to be poor in order to sustain the wealth of the others. I think that that paradigm is part of the reason where we are today. A different paradigm has to be looked at, one which we're talking about shared prosperity, shared growth, shared development. And that is particularly the image that appeals to us in Ghana. But these are some of the statements.
These are my concerns. The practicality of the issue of having shared growth, shared development, and shared prosperity without communicating and comparing progress of the individual countries. How are we going to know which country is lagging behind and why is it lagging behind? This information is available but is not shared with our communities. These are some of the questions that must be addressed by the leaders of our continent individually. Progress indicators are very important. Achieving shared growth, shared development, and shared prosperity has a lot of challenges that we are going to look at now. For this to happen, we need to continue to silence the gun. We need to strengthen our trade through a common African market. We need to collapse the inter-country borders and form one country. Having a single currency is also very important. We need to have a unifying African language. We need to have a fully operational and supportive African bank. And we need to embrace the spirit of Ubuntu as a means of strengthening our African culture. What do we mean by silencing the gun? And how are we going to silence the gun? We need to start having roundtable talks, not influenced by weaponry might, but geared at creating and promoting peace, security, and justice. Commitment to fairness, compromises, and love for one another. We need to put more focus on future shared growth, development, and prosperity, and not historical biasness. How are we going to strengthen trade through the African trade area? There will be fair trading, and we shall take advantage of economies of scale for goods and services within and beyond our African borders. We shall utilize the comparative advantage in conducting business. How do we collapse borders? By this I mean, we can decide to leave the boundaries for administration purposes. But this is going to help free movement of people and goods between borders. There will be interlinked infrastructure development and usage. It means that it's going to be easier movement and then equal treatment of people irrespective of ethnic origin. I talked about having a single currency. How is it going to help? It's going to ease trade. It's going to make the cost of doing business cheaper because the exchange transaction costs are going to be eliminated. There will be limited chance of illegitimate money, and there will be no inconveniences in money exchanging. How is the African language going to assist in shared growth, shared development, and shared prosperity? There will be no need for translation. African privacy in doing business will be promoted. African cultural values will be strengthened. Mutual respect, irrespective of ethnic origin, will be happening. There will be no superiority complex based on language, and there will be more effective communication. Having a Central African Bank will lower transaction costs, ownership and control of African countries. Management will be done by Africans, and there will be no favors based on ownership. And lastly, embracing Ubuntu. We need to love one another. We need to care for one another. We need to stop greed. Then we shall have shared growth, shared development, and shared prosperity. How are we going to resolve these risk challenges in addition to what has been mentioned? We already know these issues, and the sooner they are resolved, the better. They significantly add to the financial risk and seriously affect entrepreneurship and sustainable development. It is true that all countries are making efforts to mitigate risks separately, but without unity, we won't go very far. In terms of measuring to which extent our continent or each country is progressing to date, or at least by the end of 2022, that information must be well communicated at all levels. It becomes very difficult to determine the level of progress and confidence about the direction being taken without continuously referring to our sustainable development indicators. In conclusion, Africa has great initiatives. It must use the SWOT analysis of itself to prioritize what it wants. The perception of Africa as a risky continent to invest in should be used as an opportunity for greater dividends. However, Africa must know that risk of any form increases the cost of investing. Africa must establish a system where there is shared growth, shared development, and shared prosperity. Africa must evaluate itself in addressing the issue of risk by continuously communicating sustainable development indicators even to the common man. We must ensure that every man on the street fully understands how he contributes to the mitigation of the risks to promote entrepreneurship and sustainable development. Then Africa will flourish in no time. Let us all make our efforts to support this program for the benefit of the current and future generation. All kinds of support are highly welcome. For more information about entrepreneurship and sustainable development, feel free to contact me on +2771 543 2931 or fenlina12@gmail.com. This program was brought to you by Fenlina Management Consultants. This brings us to the end of this lecture. Please remember to subscribe and leave your comments below. This will enable us to continuously improve our level of service. Thank you for your time. May God bless you.